Welcome to the Speaker's Corner Show. My name is Heiko Khoo. The Speaker's Corner Show is broadcast on 104.4 Resonance FM every Wednesday at 3 o'clock. And it's been running since 2003. The Speaker's Corner Show is generally recorded at Hyde Park Speaker's Corner on Sunday afternoons. And you can visit our website speakerscorner.net. Now, here we are, the beginning of 2021. One of the most bizarre periods in human history, perhaps. So I thought today, rather than broadcast snippets of the shenanigans which have been going on in Speaker's Corner for the audience to hear about, they can find them online. On YouTube there's lots of material on my YouTube Heiko Khoo, or Subject Access, or this website, or Tyrant Finder covers some of these things, and Content Over Everything used to, but unfortunately they've stopped recording. Mr. Rax, there's one called GB Resistance. All these people have covered some of the very bizarre happenings at Speaker's Corner and the repression of protesters who are not accepting the mainstream narrative about a wide number of issues, and if people don't accept that mainstream narrative on the whole pandemic, then they are isolated or arrested or harassed or denigrated. And it doesn't seem to matter too much whether these people are highly qualified experts or whether they are people just protesting against what they feel are restrictions that should not be in place, or whether they feel that their civil liberties override fears of contagious disease. It doesn't seem to matter. There has been a drive to present the government's narrative as being unassailably true. In other words, that the government claims that they are merely implementing scientific decisions are not really allowed to be challenged. And that seems to be the foundation of it. And of course you can't challenge it because you don't have access to the media. And you don't have access to the media. Even if you do have access to the media, things are not permitted. And then you start to self-censor. This radio show is also self-censored. I'm having to choose to do certain things and to exclude certain things, knowing that otherwise there will be complaints to the radio station and to Ofcom about the content of the radio show. And in the last couple of days, Talk Radio, which has had some quite interesting interviews, very interesting interviews, with leading skeptics as well as leading as government officials, and they've been taken off YouTube. And of course YouTube is also a gatekeeper nowadays. But let me give you a little bit of story about this. So on the 2nd of November, I was arrested at Speaker's Corner when the police marched Tommy Robinson into Speaker's Corner. They marched him in. The police accompanied him in, and they had large numbers. That was the first time I saw so many police at Speaker's Corner in the early morning one day. And then when I challenged Tommy Robinson, I was arrested. Robinson himself was later arrested. And it seemed to me that this event set a narrative in the air, and that was that anti-lockdown protests are right-wing orchestrated events. Of course, that narrative had been around for quite a long time. And by these means, liberal opinion was supposed to come round to the view that anyone who opposes the measures taken by governments around the world to repress free speech during the pandemic is a right-wing conspiracy theorist. So that's the first thing. So by alienating the mass of the population, and in particular educated liberal opinion, from anyone who opposes the so-called lockdown, that this will, if you like, succeed in bolstering the views of the government and the actions of the state. And connected to this is a much more insipid consequence of this, which is that the concept of a plague circulating in society, and in particular now of a new mutant strand of plague spread primarily by children and used to kill your grandmother, that psychology, that argument, that belief is, to be frank, it's something out of mythology. It's like out of a grim fairy story, a grim fable. You know, the Grimm brothers. They always made such terribly frightening stories to tell to children as kind of moral lessons. And so I was even forced to look at. I watched a YouTube video the other day of the Pied Piper of Hamelin and the way in which this entered into mythology. And the Pied Piper, of course, as all of you know, frees the town of rats, but is not paid enough. Or better said, when he does it so easily and so swiftly with his beautiful piping, the mayor and the authorities think, well, we could save money by not giving him all of that. We'd give him a little bit because he did it so easily. Obviously, it wasn't so difficult. And there's a sense that the COVID billionaires, those people who've profited from the allocation of resources by government towards all these people who can offer solutions, app makers, track and trace experts, research departments investigating everything from COVID and BAME to COVID and women and COVID and children and COVID and sports, and all the huge amounts of grants and research funds and experts who've jumped in and claimed, and companies have jumped in on the bandwagon, everyone claiming they know how to offer some solution. All these different pigs with their noses in the trough of the COVID finance bonanza. All these people have an interest in maintaining the existing narrative and in pushing for a certain trajectory of motion of society. And this is despite the fact that obviously there are very large sections of business, the airlines industry, the tourism industry, the hospitality industry and so on, that are so devastated by all of this that they naturally are in total opposition. And this, of course, is manifest as well in some sections of the police force, some sections of the, not police, just there's a couple of police in front of me, that's why I'm saying that. Some sections of the establishment, for example, Sir Charles Walker and others who have made critical comments, Lord Sumption, who made a detailed critique of the legislative framework for lockdown. There are splits, of course, representing this split within the capitalist class worldwide. but in particular, we're dealing with Britain at the moment. In particular, in Britain, there are splits which represent these conflicts. But because the ruling clique in government, a sort of cabal, it was more and more centralised under Dominic Cummings, and once he was ousted, it remained centralised, perhaps under the influence of Carrie Symonds a bit more than before. But of course, all the people who got money allocated to them and who gained influence in the COVID special measures period, shall we call it, all these people are still pushing the agenda that governs government policy. And so vaccine makers, again, I can't go into too much detail, otherwise it would err on the edge of what they will call conspiracy theories. So all I'll do is point to simple facts, the general parameters of the facts, and the rest of it, we'll put online, and you can find out the extra information yourselves and draw your own conclusions as to how these things are interconnected together. So what's noticeable is that the periodization of issues can be important. So the announcement of the use of the vaccine, the Pfizer biotech vaccine, on the 3rd of December followed a petition to the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, by Mike Eden and Wolfgang Wodak, which clearly showed that the PCR test is so flawed that it cannot possibly be used either for diagnostic purposes, not on its own anyway, or for, which is a consequence of that, for determining the efficacy of a vaccine. Because if the PCR test is not standardized and doesn't detect whether someone is, or what stage of a COVID infection someone has, or whether they actually have a real infection, or whether it's SARS-CoV-2 as opposed to another coronavirus, because it's not distinct enough unless you set the CT level, the cycle level of the amplification process. Unless you set that at around 20, 25, a low level, you can't tell whether that person's infectious, infected, and so on, all these different categories that you could be. So therefore, if the PCR test is the foundation for determining the efficacy of the vaccine, then the vaccine has problems. That's what Eden and Wodak submitted to the European Medicines Agency. And a similar petition was submitted in the United States of America to the Food and Drug Administration. Now, so after this, on the 14th of December, the World Health Organization published a bulletin to people administering these tests, the PCR tests, in which they admitted everything that Eden and Wodak had said. And so now it's official WHO, so there's no danger on this getting deleted anywhere, because it's official WHO policy that the PCR test must be backed by clinical examination. So the problem for that is that Britain is not doing that. Britain just does a PCR test and says, stay at home, you've got COVID. Well, having a positive PCR test does not mean you've got COVID. COVID is an illness. It does not even mean you've got SARS-CoV-2, an active infection in your body. It could be something, a remnant of the past, could be broken particles and so on, or broken components of a virus that's dead, or that never was going to infect you because your innate immunity cleared it within a few hours or whatever. Anyway, these are technicalities, but the point being, the WHO has admitted that the PCR test is flawed. Now, had we started out with that in March, we would never be in this situation. And were the government basing its analysis on actual clinical presentation rather than on the PCR test, then all this scaremongering that we see in the news about 50, 60,000 cases would not exist. it's only because they're using the PCR test as a foundation that they can claim that so many people are supposedly down with cases, which of course is in complete contradiction to all epidemiological history, because you don't get this sort of multiple escalation unless you have 40 tests, which is what we have. We've got tests that have got an error ratio. Well, we don't know. It could be anything from 10, from 2 to 5 to 10 or even 15% at the moment, because you've got these massive factories that are basically staffed by unqualified staff doing PCR tests en masse, and even giving, even my local pharmacy now is now offering PCR tests. You can go in there and they stick a bud up your nose and then send it off for testing. And so the inaccuracy of doing such vast numbers of tests ultimately must be behind what is happening today. We've got the epidemic of testing. Something like 2.5 million tests or more are now done in Britain in England and Wales every week. And this is probably the biggest, I haven't checked, but I think it's the biggest testing program in the world. And Britain, of course, gained a foothold within the WHO at the same time, they became the biggest donor to the WHO at the same time as they launched this thing called the Moonshot Program. The Moonshot Program was a sort of government private sector joint venture to launch this massive testing program. So Britain's reputation worldwide in terms of its pharmaceutical industry, its scientific knowledge, its capacity and so on, was all integrated, was put on the line, if you like, by Britain's launching of the Moonshot operation and of the buying a 30% stake in the WHO. And don't forget, Donald Trump had been withdrawing from the WHO, so this was a new attempt by a Western government to gain an influential position. So I think the figures now basically is Britain, I think China, and then Gates, and then perhaps the USA. But obviously the USA is going to jump back in now with Biden elected. So these are a sideline, but it's an important thing to understand, to know why Britain adopted the method it's adopted. Having said that, I mean, a lot of European countries are adopting the same type of panic mode. In other words, here we are a year in, and we've got going back into insane lockdowns. A year ago, at least, people could tolerate this. It just came in, and people were worried, they were getting a little bit scared, and then a lockdown came. It lasted a few weeks, and then it appeared to be, it looked like the thing was over. And it almost, I'm still of the view that it almost certainly was over then, and that what we have now is something quite different. It is a product of what has happened. Now, of course, you can go back over the stats. For example, there's a video circulating made by a woman by the name of Debbie Hicks, and it shows an empty hospital in Stroud in Gloucestershire. And an NHS member of staff, well, I spoke to 2 NHS members of staff this morning. One of them is a doctor and one of them is a nurse. Well, the nurse I spoke to, I communicate with them online. And the doctor explained to me that in her hospital there are about 900 or about 1,000 beds normally. Just wait for these cars to pass. There are about 1,000 beds normally, but due to the spacing arrangements, in other words, hands, face, space type mentality, but implant that into a hospital, they have about maybe 50%, 60% of capacity at the moment. So they've reduced the number of beds, perhaps down to 500 from nearly 1,000. And so if someone goes into a hospital and videos it, I think it probably is true that they're going to find half-empty hospitals. Now, what's the rationale behind it? The rationale behind it is you don't want to have infections in a hospital, because that same doctor told me that only a couple of months ago, I remember her explaining that they had one person in that hospital who was infected, and then within a few days they had 100, and in a few days more they had 250, and these were infections transmitted inside the hospital. And so the problem of distinguishing between people who come to hospital with a respiratory infection that can be called COVID, and people who come into hospital and are infected inside the hospital, and then those who are tested positive who come in for something else. Now, the doctors, as I understand it, do clearly differentiate between these different categories. The problem is that as far as the national statistics are concerned, these categories are not subdivided. So, for example, if someone goes into hospital and is totally asymptomatic but tests positive for SARS-CoV-2, the doctor will know that that person is asymptomatic. But if that person does die of an aneurysm or whatever, then they will still go down in the national statistics as a COVID death. Now, of course, that's a serious problem, because then we don't actually know what we're talking about. And when the government talks to you about the numbers of deaths, then those numbers of deaths are a meaningless terminology unless you can differentiate between those different things, which doctors actually have been doing. And so then there's the measures taken, you see. So the measures taken, if you are spreading out the beds in a hospital because you want to avoid transmission, that's because you haven't resolved the problem of transmission between people inside the hospital, which means you haven't resolved the question of air movement. And it's been known pretty much since March 2020 that transmission takes place primarily in enclosed spaces where the airflow and the air transformation, in other words, the replacement of air, is limited. So if you're in an enclosed room, I did this many times, but let me repeat again: enclosed space, more than 10 minutes, less than one meter apart, facing each other. If someone's coughing, there's a fair chance you're going to catch a virus from them if they've got it, a respiratory virus. Now, if on the other side you are in an aeroplane and the air conditioning system in the aeroplane replaces the air 10 times an hour, if you're sitting next to someone who's got a SARS-CoV-2 COVID infection and coughs, and the likelihood is you will not catch the virus from that person, because the airflow is replacing the air sufficiently so that you cannot acquire a high enough viral load to get seriously infected. Now, what does that mean? Well, the hospitals should have looked at this question in March. And by the summertime, all the hospitals should have restructured their hospital internal airflow design systems to make sure that transmission could not occur as a consequence of the airflow in the hospital. But instead of that, we know that many transmissions, I don't know what percentage, but many transmissions are happening inside hospitals, precisely because of this lack of consideration of the airflow. Now, just got a bit of traffic here. Now, these airflow considerations, of course, are true also for family settings and the rest of it. And there was a little bit of talk about this just before Christmas, But what are you supposed to do? Open the window? We did in our family. We opened the window at Christmas. My mother's a bit worried. You put the heater on and you open the window, just like these open air in the summertime. You remember Soho and other places, they put tents outside the cafes and restaurants so you could sit outside, have some external heaters, and there was no record of additional transmissions. Now, the biggest con of all in terms of civil liberties, Speaker's Corner, is that we have gone to the police again and again, and we have we have explained to them there is no evidence of transmission at demonstrations. There's no evidence of people catching coronavirus in open air events, pretty much anywhere in the world. And the only people, some people have said to me, oh, well, what about Cheltenham? What about Liverpool? Well, don't forget, that was all before the measures were taken, before people knew what they were doing. And I think if you actually check, you'll find that the transmissions that did occur in those places occurred in bars and restaurants and so on, around the area of the Cheltenham Festival or around the area of the Liverpool football match. Time is running out. I just want, as I said, I wanted to cover the broad spectrum of realities about this, and to look at the issues that we're confronted from a broad overall perspective. Why is it our civil liberties are being taken away for open air demonstrations? I mean, I've been arrested 5 times now. Piers Corbyn's been arrested 8 times. I saw people arrested at Speaker's Corner for nothing, literally for nothing, over the last few weeks. And one thing I did find out, however, was that it seems that the NUJ, that there's a campaign by some department of the government to try and limit free speech in the media. And the way to do this is to cut off any information about unrest. And the way to do this has been to try and claim that the only journalists who are legitimate journalists are NUJ, National Union Journalist members, and I am an NUJ member, and that they must have their press card on them. And the police managed to remove my press card, I think against the law, on the 5th of November demonstration. And then I've discovered, after requesting my what's called subject access request, so I requested all the information about me held by the NUJ, the National Union Journalists, and it turned out the NUJ have been collaborating with the police authority to try to get me de-recognised as a journalist. Claiming that I've only ever made a blog or something like that. I mean, I've been making this radio show since 2003, and I've been writing for China.org.cn, it's a Chinese State Council website, since 2009, and I've published many other things, including my own things, and if you check back on what I've been publishing during the course of the pandemic, I'll repeat again, I was one of the most, if the not the most vociferous advocate for lockdown in March last year, and you can see that at Speaker's Corner, the videos from the 8th of March when I spoke at Speaker's Corner. However, I envisaged that would be falsely envisaged, I admit I was wrong. I falsely envisaged that would be, or could be, a means. I envisaged it could be a means for the labour movement and for people to get active in volunteering to protect the health of the community, having sort of street patrols like they do in Cuba and that sort of thing, to protect the health of the people, provide people what they need during a 3-week period when we can clear the virus and the problem be over. And here we are, 10 months on, going into another so-called lockdown. And I have to say that this is, the conspiracy, in some ways the conspiracy theorists are a lot closer to the truth than the mainstream, because the actual measures taken, not those that are proclaimed, the actual measures taken, the actual behaviour of the police, the actual manipulation of the media, the actual manipulation by the government, the actual manipulation by big pharma, by big tech and so on, is so vast, so ubiquitous and so global in its scope that it does push people towards the idea of conspiracy, which I've avoided for the following reason, primarily because of incompetence. You see, the ruling classes have never been the most competent coordinators and organisers of consistent and coherent policies. So to establish a 1984 dictatorship, there have to be forces driving it, and then corresponding interests pushing it through. And I think there are those, better said, but their consistency is, is chaotic and anarchic, and of course that corresponds with the nature of capitalism. That was the Speaker's Corner show for this week. Thanks for joining. See you again sometime soon, hopefully at Speaker's Corner some days, although it might be somewhere else in Hyde Park. We'll have to check that out. And that's enough for now.